Shabbat Shalom. Yesterday, as I was getting Sela ready for school, she snuck off to do a little bit of science. She took our bottle of milk and her little plastic Elmo bowl filled with bite-sized peanut buttered toast, and sitting by the door as I was putting on my jacket and shoes, she proceeded to dump one directly into the other, creating this slurry of soggy brown white mess. "Oh no, it's spilled, it's messy," my 2.5-year-old informs me. And I am trying to be a gentle, soft-spoken parent. So upon witnessing this coagulated thing that is now going to make us very late to both school and to work, I took a deep breath and started cleaning up. "Yes, honey, it's messy. You made the mess. Can you help me clean it up?" And my dear, sweet, darling daughter looks at me, and until this point in the morning, she had been in a great mood. And she told me, "I miss you," when she woke up. And she'd given me a big hug just a minute before. And she'd even let me put her hair up, which is something she hates. And that little angel of a girl put her hands on her hips and said, "No! More toast!" And then she began to bawl her eyes out, roll on the floor, and scream. And nothing, no amount of study, no text, no philosophical insight, no spiritual facilitation has ever helped me understand Moses at Sinai, Moses' pride and his love, and his frustration and his flaring anger, more than parenting a toddler. In our Torah portion this week, as we have all just seen, we read the Decalogue, the Aseret HaDibrot, these 10 utterances, and Torah is brought into our world in a primordial cosmic sense. Revelation occurs as God's infinite vastness descends onto Sinai, and light becomes sound, sound becomes light, time itself unwinds, so that each and every Jewish soul that has ever been and ever will be can stand at that moment. And our rabbis are both moved and awed. They are impressed and emotional, and some are even skeptical. 2 words feed a rather odd but powerful midrashic rabbinic interpretation, which argues that this miraculous moment of the giving of Torah may not have been nearly as gentle or well received as we first assume. In Shabbat 88a, Rabbi Abdimi Bar Chama Bar Chisa interprets the following verse, "And they stood at the foot of the mountain." And he chooses to interpret it quite literally, Petachtit hahar. Translation is interpretation, and we normally understand this phrase to mean at the bottom of the mountain, or at the base of the mountain, or at the foot of the mountain. But at its most literal, it means underneath the mountain. And so, Rab Abdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa argues that God actually lifts up Sinai by its root and holds it suspended above the Israelites so that they stand quite literally underneath the mountain. And then comes the twist. The rabbi, in pure midrashic fashion, says that God then threatens the Israelites, saying, "If you accept my Torah, good. And if not, this will be your grave." Now, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, who is studying with the first rabbi, raises one of many objections that should have come to your mind in that moment. And his objection points out that such a reading of the text, besides being vastly out of character for this moment, would also render the entirety of the Torah invalid. You cannot obligate people in the mitzvot against their will. You either enter the covenant willingly, or you are born into it carrying on the obligations of your parents from generation to generation. And therefore, if God's great gift, this original gift of the Torah, was actually coerced through threats of violence, it is not valid. And if it is not valid, it is not the Torah. Now, parents in the room, myself included, know that there are moments when we coerce our children into right and proper action, not, God forbid, with threats of violence, but with offers of rewards and consequences. First dinner, then, excellent. If you don't say you're sorry, go to bed, time out, right? But we also, as loving parents, hope that our children will ultimately learn the consequences of their actions and learn to act with respect and responsibility for positive reasons. That they should develop the ability to tell the difference between doing something for the right reason, out of joy, out of gratitude, out of communal responsibility, rather than doing it out of fear of punishment. Help me clean up, because we all have responsibilities. Be kind to others. Learn to share, because it makes the world a better place. Say thank you, not just to people, but to God as well, because we are part of something bigger than ourselves. At the Dufferin Mall, there is a large plastic Mickey Mouse carousel ride. And for $1, you can sit next to Mickey, and the golf cart that he's driving will start to shake and move, and music will play, and the lights will light up, and it is one of my daughter's favorite things in the world. And more than once, I have caught myself, when I'm done feeding loonies into the machine, but she wants one more ride, and the tantrum is building, I have to actively stop myself from saying the following phrase: if you don't behave, we won't ever do this again. Both because it is dishonest, we will almost certainly be back, and because that's not the way I want to convince her to be calm. That's not the way I want to convince her to be responsible. I don't want to lift a mountain above her head, even if it gets me the results I want, because that's not the basis of the relationship I want to have with my child. And by that same mentality, that God does not want a relationship that's meant to be born out of love to instead be born out of fear, is expressed in the dismissal and the refusal of this argument that God lifts the mountain by sages both ancient and modern alike. And in fact, three of our greatest theologians in the 20th century, David Hartman, Yitz Greenberg, and Eugene Borowitz, all root their covenant theology in the rejection of that midrash, and instead ask this fundamental question, saying, what actually keeps us in relationship with God? It can't be fear. It can't be punishment. It has to be something else. Returning to the Talmud, Rav, one of the greatest Babylonian sages, attempts to soothe out this moment and get rid of the threat of violence. He says, maybe it happened, but the Jewish people accepted the Torah willingly. They might not have done it then, but do you know when they did do it? In the days of Achashverosh, in the days of Purim, and he pulls out the scroll of Esther, and he points to a line that says, and they upheld it, and they accepted it. Do you see? They upheld what they'd already accepted. And so even if God lifted a mountain above your head, 1,000 years later, we reaffirmed our commitment to Torah of our own free will, and there was no implied threat. I don't really buy it. Instead, I looked to some other sources which converse on why does this midrash come into being at all? Where does this come from? Such an odd story, such an out-of-character moment. And two possibilities come to the minds of our scholars. And the first is that this story of the mountain over the heads of the people was just part of the popular consciousness of the Jews at the time. And if you look in other places in the Talmud, specifically Avodah Zarah, a different midrash is brought forward about God shopping the Torah around to the different people of the world, and it too ends with the mountain being held over the heads of the Jewish people, but in an entirely different context and accredited to an entirely different teacher. So we know that this was probably a popular story, and that even 2,000 plus years ago, maybe our Jewish people loved a little bit of gentle self-ribbing. When, remember when God held that mountain above our head and said, if you don't be my people, I'm going to squash you? It's the equivalent of when Jewish comedians get up today and make jokes about boobies and anxieties and rabbis and kosher food. But the other very real theological response to this is that this is a midrash which is itself meant to flip itself on the head. That it's built to be rejected. Because it talks about the theological anxiety of living to a high moral standard. The Torah asks us to be better than we are. The Torah asks us to be better partners than we actually are, to be better citizens than we actually are, and to be better parents and children than we actually are. And in the face of that high bar, constantly asking you to just be better, there's a voice that cries out and says, but maybe I don't want that. You're making me live up to this high standard, and I should have the right to refuse it. I should have the right to reject your high standard and to just be selfish and to just be conceited and to just not have to worry about any standard that I have to hold except for my own. And so this midrash comes to poke holes in that childish, egocentric perspective and say, no, God never held a mountain over anybody's head. But nevertheless, one day you'll grow up and realize that all of those teachings were really quite important, and you'll take them on of your own free will. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory riffs on this a little bit. He says, and I quote, "The real test of faith always comes when God is hidden." Rava quotes from the book of Esther is not haphazard, it is pointed and precise. Esther is one of only 2 books in our Tanakh which does not contain the name of God. And the book relates the first warrant for genocide against the Jewish people. The Jews who remain Jews under such a threat, under such a condition, are proof positive that they did in fact reaffirm the covenant. Obstinate in their disbelief during much of the biblical era, they came obstinate in their belief ever afterwards. The Jewish people, faced with God's presence, disobeyed. But confronted with God's absence, they've stayed ever faithful. And that is the paradox of our stiff-necked people. In the late 19th century, Rabbi Meir Simcha of Dvinsk also played with this lifted mountain, and he penned an alternative understanding. He says, yes, God does hold the mountain over the heads of the Israelites, but in doing so shows them the fullest possible understanding of wonder. This was their God, who could do unimaginable things, who could dry out the sea, who could alight the heaven with flame, and now who could lift up the very earth and show them the root of the mountain. And in that moment, the Israelites understood with perfect clarity the truth that they would always pass on to their descendants, that the very world depended on this Torah, on this teaching, that their heavenly parent was giving to them in this moment. And so, this week's Torah portion marks a transition from the miraculous grandness of revelation and redemption and into the more mundane tradition of ethics and laws and societal norms. And I want us to stay in Rabbi Simcha's teaching about wonder and transition about awe and love, because that is the understanding of the hanging mountain that I'm going to carry going forward. I know that there are almost certainly moments when I loom above my little girl, and I give her instructions, and I hope for her future, and I pass on to her the lessons that I hope and pray will make her life more fulfilling. And I have no doubt that there are moments, as I stand above her doing these things, that she looks up and wonders about the seemingly impossible weight of this serious thing that I am holding above her. And so my prayer then is that in time, she will look back at those moments and realize with that clarity and with that awe that she could always depend on that wisdom, and that she could always depend on that relationship and that love, and that in time she herself will too affirm it of her own free will, and one day she will pass it down in turn. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.